My name is Boone Rogers, and this is my review slash talk of the 2022 movie Skinamarink horror. Overall, I thought that it was a very fantastic movie. It's one of the few 5-star movies that I have on Letterboxd. One of 4 horror movies that I have 5-starred. So pretty high praise for me. I would also say overall, this might be what I would describe as the scariest movie I've ever seen in certain aspects, but not in others.
What aspects would you say is the scariest?
I would say it does the best job of building suspense and probably has some of the best jump scares, even though some of them are not the most creative, but I think they're still done well. A lot better than other modern horror movies do in theaters, because those are obviously all less scary films because they want more people to see them. And if a movie's really scary, people won't actually see it. But I think that this movie doesn't have super scary themes like movies like Hereditary or Midsommar might. Because those movies, I think, for me at least, I was more scared of the idea of cults or crazy people than what was actually happening. I think this movie does a better job of suspense and terror and probably jump scares. But Midsommar and Hereditary, I think, maybe do a better job of like having a real fear of something. Like this movie, I would say is more just like actually feeling scared, but not really feeling terrified.
What makes it scary?
For me, and I think this is something that's so interesting about this movie, is that it is so polarizing, and it's either this might be the scariest movie you've ever seen, or it might not scare you even a little bit. I think that's how it is for everybody. I don't really think there's an in-between, is because it really kind of banks on the fact of being scared of not only dark places or ominous places, not always dark, but very off shots, like not, off camera angles that are usually pointed at ceilings or just, it's not natural. It doesn't feel right to the human mind, so it's kind of like all of these camera angles kind of offset you already. Even though there's nothing creepy going on in them, you never have seen this before, so it feels so unnatural as a human to see like this kind of stuff.
So you think the choice of camera angles alone is creepy and disorienting?
Yeah, I think that this movie did a lot of things almost near perfectly. Like, I think one thing that was fantastic is the audio in this movie. There's a lot of... It's very simplistic, but I think the audio is almost one of the best things because almost every noise can scare you. And they kind of, like a lot of other movies, use sounds as a reoccurring theme. And it'll pop up in the beginning and then kind of come back later, and then you'll be like, oh, shit, like I'm hearing this again. And it kind of activates like a fear instinctively because you've heard it before, or on another part that was scary.
What fear do you think this movie's tapping into?
I think that this movie taps into the fear of empty houses. It's definitely analog horror, where it's like the fear of news channels or fear of VHS tapes. Like it's kind of a fear of older stuff, and I think that's a big thing because it's like a childhood thing, and some people are scared of like creepy childhood things like TVs, static TVs, rotary phones, like stuff like that, which you can see a lot in this movie. They take a lot of those analog horror aspects, and analog horror is also a lot of times just shots of things that are unsettling. Like it's not meant to be anything deeper than that. It is just, here is something that's scary looking, and be scared of it. For a lot of people, it is scary, and for a lot of people, it's not. That's kind of another reason I was saying this movie's polarizing, is because it is like, if you're not scared of that type of horror, like analog horror, that's almost entirely what this movie is. But I think it definitely goes into the analog side of like being scared of being a kid and being alone in a house. And also, it's a very young thing to be afraid of, but the dark. Like if you're, not even just the dark, but I was saying this to you after we watched it, just ominous rooms or creepy rooms. Because half of the shots in that movie, I would say, have light in them. And it's not dark, and it's still very creepy because of the angles and the prop setup and all of that other stuff. And sometimes the audio. Sometimes the audio can be scary even when it's completely light. I would also say it kind of goes into the fear of like small spaces. Like it's a very confined movie that's almost always in hallways. Like the only real one big room would be the living room, the TV room. And that's kind of the only space that's ever safe. And then everything else is these very small hallways and closets and bathrooms, all spaces that like, I think it tries to make you feel very trapped in.
Why do you think the living room is the only safe space?
I think that's established as a safe space earlier on to make it feel safe for the viewer, and then it throughout the movie falls apart. You know, like it's whenever the kids venture out is when something scary happens. And then as it gets closer, it's like the scary stuff starts getting closer and closer. And then obviously, you know, at the end, the kid stabs himself. And that's like in the living room. Like the monster is there, or whatever it is. You know, the entity, the monster, the void is there. And it's kind of gotten to him. And then that's when the whole living room kind of falls apart. And it's like, now the living room is the scariest thing in the movie, when before it felt like a safe spot. And I think that might be the reason why it was like a bigger space with more wide angles. And I think the TV was also a dual-edged sword too. Like that was meant to be comforting, and then obviously got very scary in the end. Like they use, you know, before they kind of are just showing cartoons, and it's like, okay, this is a nice break, although unsettling still. And then later it's like they use the sound and the theme of the cartoons to kind of indicate at what's happening or what's going to happen.
Cartoons, but the audio was fucked up and the video was like fluttering in a way. And I remember that they kept using that scene where the bird vanishes.
They kept looping it, yeah. Or they didn't keep looping it, but the VHS supposedly broke. But obviously I think the whole theme of the movie is that whatever's controlling the house, whether, like I said, it's a void or monster, it's very ambiguous, which I like. I think that's great, because it makes it so you can really think about it. I think that thing was doing everything, you know, like I think that was looping the VHS and all that. I also think later on when the blood is splattering on the floor and like going back and forth, for me that felt like something where it was like the monster, I'll just call it the monster from now on because it's easier. The monster was like looping that to make the kid feel pain or something, you know, like it was almost like a torture. That definitely freaked me out a little bit. Like I was like, that's really creepy, because it was like, it kind of seemed like the monster was like enjoying doing something really sadistic, which obviously in a horror movie would make sense, but it still is something that was like very creepy.
And you were talking about like things that you're afraid of as a kid. One of the scenes that really stuck with me was the scene where the voice is telling the kid to look under the bed.
Yeah, that's another, I think that brings me to another point that I think makes this movie one of my favorite horror movies, is back to the audio and cinematography. It's also just like the pacing is fantastic. I think in a lot of horror movies, you'll have the build up to a jump scare, and then the jump scare, and the jump scare is relief, and then they build up again. But a lot of horror movies, the build up is not that scary, and you can almost count down to the jump scares. You know, it'll be like, oh, it's gonna happen in 3, 2, 1, jump scare, and you're like, okay. Sometimes it'll get you a little bit. But this movie, it does a fantastic job of holding shots, and also just kind of the way the whole movie's structured. You never really know what's going to be scary or what's just going to be ominous, which makes kind of all of it scary. But some of the shots, like that bedroom scene, are just held for so long, and it just builds so much terror. And I think it's done so well.
The looking under the bed was kind of a ruse. It wasn't what was under the bed. It's what he saw once he looked up from under the bed.
Mm-hmm. Outside of this movie, I think that is also a classic horror thing where you expect the jump scares, not where it's actually going to be. But I think, again, this movie did a great job with that, because they almost doubled down on it. At first, it was like, okay, the mom, he goes into the room, you're like, okay, these legs are going to be scary, right? It's going to be the person. And then it's like, oh shit, it's going to be under the bed. And then it's not under the bed, then you go back up, and then it's like, oh, it's going to be back to the mom, because now, or whoever it is, because now they're on the other side of the bed. And then you're back under the bed. It's like, it keeps switching, when I feel like in other movies, it's just like, it's going to be this once. They just kind of set that in your mind once, and then the fake out is right away. But that one keeps going back and forth between a couple really scary things. And like I said, it's so drawn out that like, you don't know when it's going to happen. Like it pans the room and pans up and down. That's also one thing I enjoyed about the movie that I didn't really talk about with you. I think a lot of that movie is meant to be from the kid's perspective. I mean, obviously, either the kid having the camera or just through the eyes of the kid. But I think it makes it a lot scarier because it's done so well with both the angles, like the height and how slow and what they're doing, but it makes you feel like you're in that scenario, which I think is something this movie does that other horror movies do, but when you watch something in third person versus first person, it's different feelings, and I think this movie really captures that feeling of being there and being scared.
That's interesting, because when I was watching it with you, I was trying not to be scared because it was obviously scary, and I was like making jokes, blah, blah, blah. But then when I woke up in the middle of the night and I just looked up at the ceiling and I realized it was the same angle I was watching through 75% of this movie, I was like, oh, fuck.
Yeah. One thing that I think this movie just did really well, like I said before, is that it is kind of that fear of something so basic. Like, there are the two sides to it. You know, there's that fear of if you're scared of the void or what, you know, like stuff that's not as real, then that side can still be scary, but there's a lot less of that. But if you're just kind of scared of things that are ominous and creepy, then this movie is like really scary. And like you said, afterwards, it's like you see it all the time. You know, it's like the light in your room might be off and you're like, I'm scared to look in here.
Right. You're laying in bed and you just wake up. Your viewpoint is limited to the ceiling and the top of the wall. And a lot of times, this movie or not, you're thinking about what's just underneath what I can see, right? Like I'm looking at the ceiling because I'm laying on my back in bed, but it's dark in here. I can't see under the bed, so that feels scary. I can't see around the edge of the bed, and that's dark, so that feels scary. This movie seems to really embody that feeling if I'm laying in bed in the darkness and I'm just imagining all the things that are outside my field of vision.
I think the last thing that I say this about almost every movie, about every horror movie, and again, this would be a major spoiler for the movie. Showing a monster is so hard to do in horror because it's just the way the human mind works. Like when you can grasp something, you can come to terms with it. But when you don't know what's there, it's much scarier. And this movie shows things, but not the thing. It never has a form, you know? The most you could say it ever has a form is at the end. And that's still left it gives you so little that it's still so scary. Because you don't know what the body is. You don't know any of that. Like, it's all left to just your imagination. And I think that's another reason why I loved the ending of this movie is I think the ending is one of the scariest scenes, maybe in the whole movie. And then it ends and you're kind of just like, it leaves that feeling there, which is really good. Like, I feel like when some horror movies end, it's just done. And that's like, okay, now I'm not scared anymore. Like, it's finished. But that movie, it kind of has that weight to it at the end, which I really liked. That's also another thing. I think that the whole, if I had to give that movie not a theme, but like what happened, the story, I think at the end that was the house disappearing. Because throughout the movie, everything's disappearing. You know, the doors, just straight up stuff, the toys on the roof, the things inside the house. And then at the end, it's even the pictures of the kids. So I think it is like this void or whatever is slowly just erasing everything that is real about the house or whatever. I mean, I don't know. Like I said, it's so vague. I think you can interpret it a lot of different ways, but that's the way I took it. And I think that's pretty interesting.
I watched it with you with lights on. I insisted on having lights because I'm an old man and I like having lights so I don't get a headache when I'm trying to watch a movie. But you watched it in a different way and you said it was scary that way.
If someone else were to watch this movie, I think the best way to watch it would be with no other people in the room. I was on a call with friends and we were even making jokes through parts of the movie and it was the most terrifying movie I've ever seen, even with that. And I even had my lights on at some points. I would just say not having a physical person near you is very important because it increases the fear of a lot of what's around you. I think headphones are incredibly important. The voices, the noises, and when you have a good headset on, it's like it almost feels real. And sometimes it's scary and you're like, is this actually, you know, did I hear that noise outside of the movie? And then obviously I think having the lights off. Other movies, it might make it a little bit more scary. This, it could take it from not scary to you to the most scary movie you've ever seen. Like, I think you might not love it if you're watching it with 5 friends all joking in the light because you're never going to build suspense. It's not going to happen. You're not going to be paying attention enough. But when you're locked in with it, it builds up a lot quicker than other movies might.
That brings me to another interesting question, which is like, if I saw this movie without you, I might think like, oh, you know, you're a young person. This movie might really challenge your patience.
100%.
Very slow. This movie is maybe the slowest movie I've ever seen. Like, you could describe this movie as 85 minutes of shots of hallways.
Yeah.
Long, still, lingering shots of hallways.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't be very far off.
I agree. I think that was one thing I was kind of saying about the design choice, is that like increases the fear by so much, because some of the shots are like, okay, that was really scary. And then others, nothing happens, but you don't know that. When you're watching it all the way through, it's like, what's going to be scary here, what's not? You know, you don't know. Some of the shots are more forgiving and less scary, and some of them are more scary. You know, like one that always creeped me out, but almost nothing happens, is the hallway where it's just the door and then it's pitch black. They show that like 4 times, and no jump scares ever happen from that, but it's a great fear because it's just that door and then nothingness. Like it's complete black. That's another thing. It's a very dark movie. Like you can't see a lot in it, which, like I said before about monsters, I think is great. It leaves a lot to the imagination. I can tell you the first time I watched it, at least 3 times, I was like, there's something in that darkness moving around. And Logan and Brandon were like, no, there's not. Like you're seeing that with your mind. I was like, no, there's definitely, like I see something in there, but it's so dark that you don't know.
But you also, in addition to enjoying it the first time you watched it, because you didn't know what was going to happen, you happily watched it a second time when you knew that it was mostly 80 minutes of empty rooms.
And I can say, what will attest to how good I think this movie is, there were probably a good 3 or 4 scenes that still terrified me. I mean, you might have seen it at the end. I was looking away again almost. I mean, I had kind of forgot that nothing happens at the end, but I was still so scared. And I even knew the jump scare that was coming in the mom scene. I knew exactly what it was, and I was so scared. That's how well done it is. And some of the shots are still just so unsettling that even when I knew it wasn't near a jump scare, I'd be scared of that.
That shot that you're talking about where the mom is sitting with her back to the camera, motionless on the other side of the bed, that's the most hateful shot in the whole thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's the scene that goes on just very, very long, and it just gets more and more. There's just no relief.
Right, like, why isn't she turning to look at me?
Mm-hmm.
Or what would happen if she did?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
I'm assuming that's not the real mom in the room. I'm assuming that's the thing. You know, later on, that face is obviously, I think that is it. I think it also might take the form of the telephone. You know, like all of those might be it, whatever it is.
Okay. I like horror movies. Tell me why I should spend 80 minutes with a movie looking at empty rooms. Like, why should I watch this movie?
I think that if you have any appreciation of if you have, like, if you critically think about movies a lot, I think you should watch it just for the fact that the audio, the cinematography, the pacing, some of the directional decisions are all just fantastic. Like, it's very, if you can think about movies on that deeper layer, I think you can pick up on all of the things that, even if you don't like it for what you see, you can recognize, I think, that this movie does so many things fantastically. But I think if you're a more casual fan, you should watch it just because it's a unique experience. I don't think there has ever been another movie like this that's been popular. This is probably the first movie. There have been other things like this that have been popular on YouTube, on TikTok, whatever, that have been popular. But an analog horror movie has not really existed. The closest thing to it would be like found footage movies. That's kind of the closest things that have blown up and turned into real movies, you know, like Blair Witch and whatever. Stuff like that that's very big is similar to this, but nothing is really analog like this. So just for that, it's a unique experience. Like you said, I think if you're a younger audience, it can be hard. If you don't have an attention span, I think the important thing that I would say for any low attention viewers would be try to stick throughout the first third. If you can get, because the second act into third act is where it picks up. It still is slow throughout the movie, but then things start happening that get you interested and they get you actually scared. And that fear lingers long enough that hopefully it can hold your interest. If you're not super critical, I would watch it just alone with headphones in the dark. And I think it will scare you no matter what. I think this is a movie that you should watch if you want to be scared. I think this will achieve that no matter what, which not every horror movie does for everyone, but I think this movie can scare at least every person in one way. I think it does have a scare for every person, which I think is a success for a horror movie. Because I think there are a lot of horror movies that don't have any scary value at all to some people.
It's worth saying that this movie was made for $15,000.
Yeah, very low budget, which I think shows on a wider scale, not just about this movie, but all movies, how much money can be wasted on movies. Like, you see movies like The Gray Man, that action movie on Netflix, and it was awful. Like, I think it just shows, like, if you have skill, you need a lot less money to make something really, really good than if you're just throwing money at it and hoping it works, which I think is really, really cool to see.
What's on your shirt?
What did we decide it was? Mozart with beats on?
Could be.
Could be. Some musician, and then there's a whole venue list on the back that we have no clue what it is. That's not connected.
That's for another episode. Now you're bored and you're checking your phone. All right, that's a cut. That's a wrap.